up guys, and welcome back to the channel. And on today's video we have a super special shootout. Today we are pitting the ASICS Magic Speed 4 against the Brooks Hyperion Max 2 against the HOKA Mach X 2. Alright, now you know that all three of these shoes, they kind of do the same thing, or at least they're made for the same thing, but there are some differences, and we are going to talk about those differences, and I'm going to give you my opinion. Now look, it's important to remember that this is just my opinion. Results may vary for you, but what I'm hoping that you get out of this video is just a certain perspective. So if you're looking to pick up the Mach X 2, the Hyperion Max 2, or the Magic Speed 4, then you'll have more information than if you didn't watch this video. Anyway, let's get into it. Okay, before we get into the shootout, let's get started with a couple of disclosures. This video is in partnership with my friends over at Roadrunner Sports. Now, each of these shoes was sent to me for the purpose of review. However, no one at Roadrunner Sports has told me what to say. They don't have any editorial privileges, and all the thoughts and opinions are my own. With that said, you're going to be able to pick up a pair of the ASICS Magic Speed 4 from Roadrunner Sports for $170. You're going to be able to pick up a pair of the Brooks Hyperion Max 2 for $180, and you are going to be able to pick up a pair of the HOKA Mach X 2 for $190. So right off the bat, you can see that there is an increase of $10 between each of these shoes, meaning that the HOKA Mach X 2 is $20 more expensive than the Magic Speed 4. But I want you to wait till the end of the video before you make any decisions on which one to buy. Don't just make your decision based on price. Okay, it's time for some specs. The ASICS Magic Speed 4 has 43.5mm in the heel, 35.5 in the forefoot for an 8mm drop. The Brooks Hyperion Max 2 has 36.25 in the heel, 30.25 in the forefoot for a 6mm drop, and the HOKA Mach X 2 has 44 in the heel, 39 in the forefoot. Well, that's for the men's version. The women's version has 42 in the heel, 37 in the forefoot, both for a 5mm drop. So we have 5mm drop, 6mm drop, 8mm drop. See, there are quite a few things to consider. It's not as easy to make a decision as it seems on the surface. Okay, now we come into weight. Weight is often a very important factor when we're thinking about running shoes, and ASICS claims that in a US men's size 9, the Magic Speed 4 tips the scale at 8.6 ounces or 245 grams. However, in my size, a US men's size 13, it tips the scale at 10.2 ounces or 289 grams. Moving on to the Brooks Hyperion Max 2, Brooks claims that in a US men's size 9, the Hyperion Max 2 would tip the scale at 9.1 ounces or 258 grams. However, in my size, a US men's size 13, it tips the scale at 11.1 ounces or 315 grams. And finally, the HOKA Mach X 2 in a US men's size 10. That's right, HOKA does provide their sample sizes in a size 10, but in that size, it tips the scale at 9.2 ounces or 260 grams. And in my size, a US men's size 12.5, the Mach X 2 tips the scale at 10.3 ounces or 293 grams. So as far as weight goes, the ASICS Magic Speed 4 is the lightest at 289 grams, and then 4 grams heavier is the Mach X 2. It then jumps up quite a bit to 315 grams in the Hyperion Max 2, but honestly, when I was wearing both of these on my feet, I didn't notice a difference. Okay, moving on to the materials. Let's start at the top of each one and work our way down. We can see we have quite a bit of padding around this heel collar, or I should say it's not that much padding, but it is kind of a traditional heel padding. Now the Magic Speed 4 does have a good step-in feel, and I did like the way it felt on my foot. When we come back to the heel counter, this is it's semi-rigid. It is rigid enough to hold my heel in place, but when I'm pushing on it right now, I can tell that there isn't just a rigid piece of plastic back here. As far as the upper goes on the Magic Speed 4, we're using a breathable mesh. I'd say this is the most traditional upper out of all three, and I don't think that is a plus or a minus. It just looks that way. It just looks kind of more traditional, what we would expect from a typical running shoe. Now ASICS is using different weaves just to add a little structure to the upper, and it works well. I didn't have any issues with breathability on the Magic Speed 4. As far as overlays, we have traditional overlays, got the branding on both sides, an underlay coming around the toe box just to keep that upper off your toes. Of course, a reinforcement along the eyelet chain. Pretty minimal. Remember, all these shoes are made for picking up the pace. You know what I mean? They're not the daily trainer, they are made for faster miles. And of course, all three could be used on race day if you didn't want to spring for that top-end, super expensive race day shoe. Right, moving over to the Hyperion Max 2. Now the upper on the Hyperion Max 2 is an engineered mesh. It's a lot more rigid than the Magic Speed 4, as in when I'm feeling it, it just feels a lot more coarse. But I think when I say coarse, it kind of gives off negative vibes. And I don't want you to think anything negative about the upper of this shoe. I love the upper of this shoe. I think this is probably my favorite upper out of all three. It just seems to hold my foot in place. Although when I actually compare them all together, they're all very similar as holding my foot in place, but I just really like this upper, even if I can't explain it well. The heel collar on the Hyperion Max 2 is just, it's lovely. So I would say it's not absolutely traditional, but it is more traditional than the Mach X 2, but we do have quite a bit of padding that comes all the way around this heel collar, and as far as heel lockdown goes, I think the Hyperion Max 2 is the best for me at least. The heel collar padding on the Hyperion Max 2 is definitely biased towards the top, so your heel sits in nicely, and then the heel collar just holds you in, and the heel counter on the Hyperion Hyperion Max 2 is the most rigid out of all three. So if you need that for a good heel grip, this is the one you're going to want to go with. Got that flared bit on the back, and then overlays. It's a very similar setup to the ASICS Magic Speed 4. Got the Brooks branding here on the lateral side, Brooks spelled out on the medial side. Got a fairly rigid underlay coming around the toe bumper, and then of course along the eyelet chain. And yeah, now I am going to come back to the tongue and the laces and all that in just a second. But before we get there, let's just talk about the upper of the Mach X2. Now, the upper of the Mach X2 is the most race-inspired out of all of these shoes. It is definitely the lightest. In fact, even when I hold it up, I think you guys can see right into the upper. It is the lightest and the most breathable. And this heel collar, look at this. Can you see that? It is super thin. Now, where the Magic Speed 4 and the Brooks Hyperion Max 2 each have more traditional padding, or a lot more padding around the heel collar, the Mach X2 does have just bolster padding on each side of the heel, so it doesn't come all the way around the back. The heel counter is also very loose on the Mach X2, which is very race-like, right? And I can tell you right now that out of all the three, I had the least heel security in the Mach X2. Now, I never had to use that lace lock method with this extra hole, which all three of the shoes have, but I did just feel a little looseness in my heel, especially when I was picking up the pace. So take that for what it's worth. Just like the competitors, we have very few overlays. Got the HOKA branding here, toe bumper, eyelet chain, you know, all the overlays that we would expect. So while I have the Mach X2 in my hand, let's just move on to the laces and the tongue. Now, the laces on the Mach X2, they're a little different. They're actually fairly fat. I don't want to say fat, but they're a little puffy. They're a little puffier than I've seen before. And I was actually wondering how they would work. And to my surprise, they worked absolutely fine. What I'm thinking is that when you tie these laces and you kind of lock them in, it squeezes the puffiness out and it locks them in tightly. Now, the same thing when these laces are sliding through the eyelet chains, they don't slide through as easy as on the other shoes. That really doesn't mean anything. It doesn't stop you from putting on the shoes or taking them off any quicker. But now that I've mentioned putting on the shoes and taking them off, the Mach X2 is the most difficult to put on and take off, and that is because of the more race-inspired fit. Everything is just a little tighter. I have to loosen the laces to get my foot in and out more than I have to on the other shoes. The tongue on the Mach X2 is super thin, and there is one lace loop. It's gusseted on both sides, so it's not going anywhere. It's just race day tongue through and through. Okay, let's go back to the Hyperion Max 2. Now, these have my favorite laces. The Brooks Hyperion Max 2 has the locking laces, so this is just security in lace form. When you tie these laces down, they're not going anywhere. I love them. No complaints. Now, the tongue on the Hyperion Max 2 is a fairly rigid material, but it's very thin, it's very race inspired, and the tongue is gusseted on both sides. And this is the tightest gusset that I've seen on a shoe. So when your foot goes in, it's almost so tight that it feels like you're putting your foot into a sock. That's a little over exaggeration. But let's just say that the gusset on the Hyperion Max 2 is tighter than both the Mach X2 and the Magic Speed 4. I really like how the Hyperion Max 2 feels when I put my foot into it. Okay, finally, the Magic Speed 4. Again, as we would expect, it's a super thin race day style tongue. Maybe not as minimal as my Metaspeed Edge Paris, but still very minimal. The tongue is gusseted, it does have a lace loop, and that's about it. It's fairly traditional as far as this kind of tongue goes. The sock liner on the Magic Speed 4 is not removable. The sock liner on the Hyperion Max 2 is also not removable. Wait a second. No, it is glued in, so it's not removable. And the sock liner on the Mach X2 is removable. If that matters to you, then that's good information there. Okay, let's come down to the midsole. And the midsole makes a difference, or at least the midsole usually makes a difference. And I think in the case of these three competitors, it does make a difference. But saying that, when I took each of these shoes out to actually get a feel for them right next to each other, as in running in them right after the other and running in each of them on one foot, it's actually surprising how similar they feel. But on the Magic Speed 4, ASICS is using 2 layers of Flight Foam Blast Plus. Now, between those 2 layers of Flight Foam Blast Plus is a carbon fiber plate. And then in the forefoot, there is a round puck of Flight Foam Turbo, and that's their top of the line Piba foam. So at least theoretically, once you get up on your toes, you're going to be using that little puck of Flight Foam Turbo, and it's going to provide you a little more propulsion. But for the majority of the foam in this shoe, it is Flight Foam Blast Plus. And I can say it all comes together and works very well. Of course, I do have individual reviews of each of these shoes, and I'll place links to those videos in the show notes below. For the Hyperion Max 2, Brooks is using a new foam this year, or at least new in the Hyperion Max. It's DNA Flash V2, and it's all DNA Flash V2 except in the middle, and you can see this little piece on the side here. Brooks is using their Speed Vault plate, and that is a plastic plate just to give it some rigidity. And the DNA Flash V2 is such a huge improvement over last year. It really is a solid foam, and it gives you the feeling that you can pick up the pace. And then finally, in the HOKA Mach X2, HOKA is using a dual density setup. On this colorway, it's very easy to see. This yellow foam is an EVA, so we can see it's a little thicker EVA on the back, and then coming down to quite thin in the front. And then the white foam on this colorway is Piba. So we have a lot of Piba in the forefoot, and then it thins out as we we get to the heel. Now, right in between this PBA and EVA layer, HOKA is using a P-Bax plate, which is just another way of saying a plastic plate, and it does the same thing as any plate does. It just gives it a little bit of stiffening and gives it a little propulsion when it's loaded. So now let's do a little flex test. That is actually surprisingly rigid for a plastic plate. Okay, that's that. You're just going to have to take my word for it because, okay, that is a little less rigid than the Mach X2. And then remember, we got a carbon fiber plate. Oh, this is like 10 times more rigid than the plastic plates in the Hyperion Max 2 and the Mach X2. Like that is really rigid. So just to remind you, the Magic Speed 4 does have a carbon plate, the Hyperion Max 2 and the Mach X2 are using a plastic plate. If we come down to the outsole on each of these shoes, we got a good amount of outsole rubber here on the ASICS. We have also a fairly good amount of rubber here on the Brooks. And finally, the HOKA. Yeah, we got a good amount of rubber here on the HOKA. I think if I'm looking between the HOKA and the Brooks, looks like Brooks has just slightly more coverage, but I think there's enough on the HOKA to do the job. And it looks like ASICS just has the most, I'd say. Well, maybe not. It does thin out as we get towards this back lateral edge. And I'd say Brooks is doing the best as far as rubber on this back lateral edge. Right now I'm just looking at the wear, and I have about the same amount of miles in all of these shoes. But now that I'm looking at it, I'm actually surprised. The Magic Speed 4 has the most amount of wear on this rubber, right on this back heel. And then if I look at the Brooks and the HOKA, you know what? I'm going to give the prize for the least amount of wear to the Brooks Hyperion Max 2. It looks almost brand new on here. And I can see just a little bit of wear on the back of the Mach X2, but I don't think that's a reason to actually not buy one of these shoes over the other. Now, I did already give you my sizes, and you know that I'm wearing a US men's size 12.5 in the HOKA. I'm using a US men's size 13 in both the ASICS and the Brooks. I usually wear a US men's size 13, and in most HOKA shoes, I have to go down half a size to a 12.5. With that said, all of these shoes, they fit my feet very similar, and that's as far as the width of the toe box, how much room I have between my big toe and the end of the shoe. When I was wearing each of these shoes next to each other, it was very difficult to tell if one fit more than the other. If I had to say which shoe was the absolute widest, I'm going to say it was the Brooks, but it was only by a very small amount. Oh, I should also say that I think each one of these shoes will fit feet that are slightly wider than mine. I don't think that's saying much because I think I have fairly narrow feet, but it is what it is. All three would fit feet wider than mine. Okay, now let's talk about ride. And the first thing I want to point out when we come to ride is this heel bevel on the Hyperion Max 2. It is very pronounced, and I think if you are a die-hard heel striker, then the Brooks Hyperion Max 2 is going to be for you. When I exaggerated my heel strike, I did find that the Brooks was the most comfortable shoe to run in, followed by the HOKA Mach X2, and we can see there is a prominent heel bevel right here. And then in last place for heel strikers, I think the ASICS Magic Speed 4, and there is a minimal heel bevel here. And honestly, it was nothing I noticed when I was reviewing this shoe on its own, just against itself. But when I put it up to the competition, at least for heel striking, it was the least flowy of the three. Does that make sense? Now, when it comes down to softness or firmness, and I know that's an individual assessment, it's going to depend on an individual's weight, it's going to depend on what other shoes you are comparing it against, but I actually found that the ASICS Magic Speed 4 and the Brooks Hyperion Max 2 felt fairly similar underfoot, at least at slow speeds. Now, I can say that between these two, when I started picking up the pace, I thought that the Hyperion Max 2 was a more comfortable ride. Like this DNA Flash V2 was just a little softer than the Flight Foam Bars Plus, and that's how I determined that, at least for me, I thought that the Brooks Hyperion Max 2 was a more comfortable ride than the Magic Speed 4. Now, when I really started picking up the pace, that's when the Magic Speed 4 really came into its own. Now, I think generally when we're trying to pick out a shoe, comfort is the number one thing that we have to go by. But if you are buying a shoe to run fast, which I think that is what you're doing if you're picking either of these three, then the Magic Speed 4 feels a little snappier when you're running fast than the Hyperion Max 2. And that makes sense, doesn't it? We've got a carbon fiber plate, which is a lot richer. So when we're running faster, that snappiness kind of sends us forward a little more. At least that's how it's designed. And then moving over to the Mach X2, we have the softest shoe out of all three, and that is going to be because we've got this PBA foam. Now, even though that the Mach X2 does have a P-Bax plate, so a plastic plate, I found that the ride on the Mach X2 was the most peppy. Like it was the softest, but also the most responsive feeling. And that is even going up against a shoe with a carbon fiber plate. So I guess your decision is going to come down to exactly what you're looking for. If you're looking for a shoe that fits well, or I've got to say, if you're me, my decision would come down to what I find the most important. Because I've got to say, I really like how the Magic Speed 4 and the Brooks Hyperion Max 2 fit. I think maybe the Hyperion Max 2 a little more than the Magic Speed 4. But if you're looking for something to go fast, I think the HOKA Mach X2 is going to be the shoe for you. And that's because it's got this race day fit. We've got the Piba foam, and the Piba foam makes all the difference in the world. This shoe feels like a shoe that wants to go fast. So if I had to rank the shoes that I have in front of me, I'm going to give first place to the HOKA Mach X2. I'm going to give second place to the Brooks Hyperion Max 2, and a very close third, at least close to the second place. Third place is going to the ASICS Magic Speed. So now I want to hear from you. Have you run in either of these three shoes? If you have, which is your favorite? If you haven't, has watching this video made you decide on either one of these? Drop a comment and let me know. And for now, it's Matt B. This has been a shootout between the ASICS Magic Speed 4, the Brooks Hyperion Max 2, and the HOKA Mach X2. Be kind, be happy, run well. See you in a couple of days.